The morning of June 15, 1961, dawned crisp and clear over Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. Captain Richard Holloway, a decorated World War II veteran with 20 years of commercial flying experience, arrived at the terminal at 5:30 a.m., his leather flight bag slung over his broad shoulder. At 42 years old, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had logged over 15,000 hours in the cockpit. His co-pilot, James Martinez, a younger man of 28 with a shock of dark hair and an infectious enthusiasm for aviation, was already conducting the pre-flight inspection when Holloway arrived at the gate. Their aircraft was a Douglas DC-6, a four-engine propeller-driven airliner that represented the pinnacle of piston engine technology. The particular plane they would be flying that day, registration number N7824A, had been in service for nearly a decade and had an impeccable maintenance record. The flight manifest indicated they would be carrying 73 passengers and 5 crew members from Chicago to San Francisco, a routine transcontinental journey that should take approximately 6 hours. Among the passengers boarding that morning was Eleanor Hayes, a 34-year-old schoolteacher from Evanston, traveling to visit her sister in Oakland. She wore a modest blue dress with white gloves and carried a small overnight case. Beside her in the boarding line stood Thomas Chen, a Chinese-American engineer heading to San Francisco to interview for a position at a new electronics firm. He clutched a briefcase containing his credentials and wore his best suit, despite the early hour. There was also the Whitmore family, Harold, his wife Patricia, and their 2 children, 8-year-old Susan and 10-year-old David. They were relocating to California, where Harold had accepted a management position at a shipping company. The lead flight attendant, Margaret Sullivan, a striking woman in her late 20s with auburn hair pinned in the regulation style, greeted each passenger with a warm smile as they boarded. She had been flying for Pan Continental Airlines for 6 years and took pride in her professionalism. Her fellow attendants, Carol Jennings and Linda Wang, busied themselves ensuring passengers were seated comfortably and that luggage was properly stowed. At 7:15 a.m., Captain Holloway received clearance from the tower. The 4 powerful Pratt & Whitney engines roared to life, their propellers cutting through the morning air with a rhythmic drone that passengers found oddly reassuring. The DC-6 taxied to runway 27R, and at precisely 7:23 a.m., the aircraft lifted off, banking gently westward as it climbed to its cruising altitude of 20,000 feet. The flight proceeded without incident for the first 2 hours. Passengers settled into the routine of mid-century air travel, reading newspapers and magazines, playing cards, or simply gazing out the windows at the patchwork of farmland below. The flight attendant served coffee and Danish pastries, then later a hot lunch of chicken, green beans, and mashed potatoes. Little Susan Whitmore asked her mother if she could draw pictures, and was soon absorbed in creating crayon sketches of clouds and airplanes. At 9:47 a.m. Central Time, the aircraft was approximately over western Nebraska, when Captain Holloway noticed something unusual. The instruments began behaving erratically. The altimeter needle swung wildly, the compass spun without settling, and the artificial horizon tilted at impossible angles. Though the aircraft felt steady beneath them, Martinez reached for the radio to contact Denver Center, but only static filled his headset. "Dick, I'm not getting anything on any frequency," Martinez reported, his voice tight with concern. Not even the beacon signals. Holloway scanned the sky around them. The weather remained clear with unlimited visibility, yet something felt profoundly wrong. The sunlight seemed to have taken on a strange quality, as if they were looking at it through colored glass. The clouds below them appeared to shimmer and distort, their shapes flowing like liquid. Then they saw it. Directly ahead, perhaps 5 miles distant, a wall of light materialized in the sky. It wasn't like any weather phenomenon either pilot had ever encountered. The barrier stretched as far as they could see in every direction, a curtain of pale gold luminescence that seemed to ripple and pulse with its own inner rhythm. It was as if someone had drawn a line across the sky itself, dividing the world into before and after. "What in God's name is that?" Martinez whispered. Holloway's hands tightened on the yoke. His instinct was to bank away, to avoid the anomaly at all costs. But as he began to turn, he realized the light was expanding, rushing toward them faster than any aircraft could outrun. He had perhaps 30 seconds before they would be engulfed. "Pan Continental 914, this is Denver Center, do you copy?" Holloway called into the radio, knowing it was futile. Only the hiss of dead air responded. In the passenger cabin, Eleanor Hayes had been reading a novel when she noticed a strange light through her window. She set the book down, pressing her face close to the glass. Other passengers were beginning to notice as well. A murmur of concern rippled through the cabin. Margaret Sullivan emerged from the galley and immediately saw the wall of light approaching. Her training kicked in despite her fear. She moved down the aisle with forced calm, her voice steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unusual weather conditions. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Everything is under control." But everything was not under control. Margaret could see it in the eyes of passengers, could feel it in the way the aircraft seemed to hum with a frequency that had nothing to do with its engines. Carol Jennings gripped Margaret's arm, her face pale. "What is that?" she asked. "I don't know," Margaret admitted quietly. "But we need to keep everyone calm." Young David Whitmore tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, are we going to crash?" Harold Whitmore pulled his son close, his own heart hammering. "No, son. The pilots know what they're doing. We're perfectly safe." He spoke the words with a conviction he did not feel. In the cockpit, the wall of light was now less than a mile away. Holloway could see that turning was pointless. The phenomenon surrounded them on all sides, rising from below and descending from above. There was nowhere to go but through. "Jim, secure everything," Holloway ordered. "Whatever happens, we're going to ride it out." Martinez nodded, his hands moving over the instrument panel, though most of the gauges had ceased functioning. The radio crackled suddenly, not with a voice, but with a sound unlike anything in their experience. A musical tone that seemed to resonate in their bones, a frequency that existed somewhere between sound and silence. The wall of light struck the aircraft. For an instant, time itself seemed to fragment. Holloway felt as if he were watching himself from outside his own body, saw Martinez frozen in mid-motion, his hand reaching for the throttle. Through the windscreen, he could see individual particles of light streaming past, each one carrying within it images, glimpses of other places, other times. He saw the same stretch of sky occupied by aircraft of designs he didn't recognize, sleek jets without propellers. He saw the land below transformed, cities where farmland had been, highways cutting geometric patterns across the earth. Then the sensation passed, and they were through. The instruments snapped back to normal operation. The compass steadied on a westward heading. The altimeter showed 20,000 feet. The engines maintained their steady rhythm. Outside the windows, the sky was clear and blue, the sun shining from its proper position. It was as if nothing had happened. Martinez let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. What the hell was that? "I have no idea," Holloway admitted. He keyed the radio. "Denver Center, this is Pan-Continental Flight 914. Do you copy?" This time there was a response, but not what they expected. "Unidentified aircraft, this is Kansas City Center. You are in restricted airspace. Identify yourself immediately and squawk your transponder code." Holloway and Martinez exchanged glances. Kansas City? They should have been talking to Denver. And what was a transponder? Holloway had never heard the term. "Kansas City Center. This is Pan-Continental Flight 914, a DC-6 en route from Chicago to San Francisco. We experienced some kind of atmospheric disturbance. We need to confirm our position." There was a long pause. When the controller's voice returned, it carried a note of confusion. "Say again your aircraft type? Did you say DC-6? "Affirmative. Douglas DC-6. Registration November 7824 Alpha. Another pause. Longer this time. Holloway could hear muffled voices in the background, as if the controller was conferring with someone. "Pan-Continental 914. We have no flight plan on file for you. Please state your departure point and estimated time en route." "We departed Chicago O'Hare at 07:23 hours Central Time," Holloway replied, his unease growing. "We've been airborne for approximately 2 hours and 30 minutes. The pause that followed was even longer. When the controller spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled, as if he were dealing with a potentially unstable situation. "Pan-Continental 914, please confirm your departure date." "Departure date?" Holloway felt a chill run down his spine. "June 15th, 1961. The silence on the other end lasted nearly a full minute. When the controller finally spoke, his voice had changed entirely, taking on an official, almost scripted quality. "Pan-Continental 914, remain on this frequency and maintain your present heading and altitude. Do not, I repeat, do not deviate from your current course. We are scrambling aircraft to escort you. Do you understand?" "Scrambling aircraft?" Martinez said. "Why would they—" "Understood, Kansas City," Holloway interrupted. But can you please tell us what's going on? Stand by, 9-War. In the passenger cabin, most people had relaxed after passing through the light. The aircraft was flying smoothly, the sun shone normally, and the attendants were moving about with reassuring efficiency. Margaret Sullivan forced herself to maintain a calm demeanor, though her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee for a passenger. Eleanor Hayes, however, could not shake a feeling of profound wrongness. The light had passed, yes, but something had changed. She couldn't articulate what it was, but the quality of the sunlight seemed different somehow, and when she looked at the landscape below, the pattern of roads and fields didn't match her memory of the route they should have been following. Thomas Chen had noticed something else. He wore a wristwatch, a reliable Timex that had never failed him, but the watch had stopped. The second hand stood still at 9:47, exactly the moment they had entered the strange light. He tapped the crystal, shook his wrist, but the watch remained frozen. Up front, Holloway and Martinez maintained their heading, their eyes scanning the sky for the escort aircraft they'd been promised. They didn't have to wait long. Within 10 minutes, 2 aircraft appeared on either side of the DC-6, matching their speed and altitude. But these were not the fighters Holloway had expected. These aircraft were unlike anything he had ever seen. They were swept-wing jets of a design that seemed impossibly advanced, with sleek fuselages and cockpits bristling with what appeared to be sophisticated equipment. On their tails, Holloway could make out the insignia of the United States Air Force, but the style was different from what he knew, more modern somehow. One of the pilots came on the radio, his voice young and professional. Pan-Continental Flight 9-Warftiern, this is Major Stevens, United States Air Force. I'll be escorting you to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. Please acknowledge. Major, this is Captain Holloway. Can you tell me what's going on? Why are we being diverted? Sir, I've been instructed to maintain radio silence regarding the situation. All will be explained once you're on the ground. Please follow my lead. We'll be descending shortly. Holloway wanted to argue, to demand answers, but years of military service had taught him when to follow orders. Understood, Major. We're with you. The formation descended through scattered clouds, the strange jets maintaining perfect position on either side of the vintage DC-6. Below them, the landscape gradually became more defined. Holloway could see Omaha in the distance, but even from altitude, something about the city looked wrong. It seemed larger than he remembered, more sprawling, with a highway system that appeared far more extensive than anything that had existed in 1961. As they approached Offutt Air Force Base, Holloway noticed other anomalies. The base itself was much larger than he recalled, with dozens of modern buildings and what appeared to be satellite dishes, though he couldn't imagine why a military base would need such equipment. On the ground, he could see vehicles moving about, but their designs were unfamiliar, more streamlined than the cars and trucks of his era. Pan-Continental 914, you are cleared to land on runway 30, came the voice from the tower. Emergency vehicles are standing by as a precaution. Roger, tower. We're coming in. Holloway lined up the DC-6 on the runway, its familiar handling bringing him some small comfort in a situation that was spiraling into the incomprehensible. The landing gear extended with its characteristic thud and whine, and the aircraft touched down smoothly, the propellers reversing thrust as they rolled to a stop. Pan-Continental 914, follow the vehicle with the flashing lights to your designated parking area, the tower instructed. A jeep with a yellow flashing beacon led them to an isolated section of the tarmac, far from the main terminal. As the engines wound down, Holloway and Martinez could see that they were surrounded by military vehicles. Armed soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms had established a perimeter around the aircraft. Jim, Holloway said quietly, I don't think we're in 1961 anymore. Martinez stared at the scene outside, his face pale. Then when are we? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as figures in official-looking suits approached the aircraft. Behind them, the passengers began to stir, their own questions rising like a tide that could no longer be held back. Colonel Michael Davidson stood at the base of the aircraft stairs, tablet computer in hand, trying to maintain his composure while his mind reeled with the implications of what he was witnessing. At 48 years old, he had served in the Air Force for 26 years, had commanded units in 3 conflicts, and had dealt with classified situations that would strain the credulity of most civilians. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. The DC-6 sat before him like a ghost made solid, its polished aluminum skin gleaming in the afternoon sun. It was a museum piece that had somehow flown itself into the present day. According to the preliminary reports he'd received during the scramble, This aircraft had departed Chicago O'Hare on June 15, 1961, and had simply vanished from radar and all records. It had been declared lost, presumed crashed. After an extensive search turned up no wreckage. 78 souls had been mourned, families had grieved, and the aviation community had added another mystery to its long list of unexplained disappearances. And now, 40 years later, 40 years to the day, it had reappeared on radar over Kansas, requesting landing clearance in a routine transmission that suggested its crew had no idea that anything unusual had occurred. Davidson's tablet displayed a secure feed from Washington. The Joint Chiefs were watching this unfold in real time. The Secretary of Defense was on a conference call with the President. Every three-letter agency in the government was mobilizing resources, and it all rested on his shoulders to manage the initial contact. Dr. Sarah Chen, a physicist from Los Alamos National Laboratory, stood beside him. She was a slight woman in her early 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She had been helicoptered in from New Mexico the moment the anomaly was confirmed. Her specialty was temporal mechanics, a field that existed mostly in the realm of theoretical physics, until today. The radiation signature is unmistakable, Doctor, Chen said, studying her own equipment. The hull is emitting chronometric particles at levels I've only seen in controlled laboratory conditions. This aircraft has definitely experienced a temporal displacement event. In English, Doctor, Davidson requested. This plane traveled through time, Colonel. It left 1961 and arrived in 2001 with no subjective time having passed for those aboard. For them, it's been a few hours. For the rest of the world, it's been 40 years. Davidson felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. How is that possible? I don't know, but we need to examine every inch of this aircraft and interview every person on board. This could be the most significant scientific discovery in human history, or it could be an existential threat. Until we know which, we treat it as both. The aircraft door opened, and Captain Holloway appeared at the top of the stairs. He looked exactly as he did in the photographs from 1961 that Davidson had pulled up on his tablet. The same strong jawline, the same steady eyes, the same captain's uniform that had been the height of professional aviation attire 4 decades ago. Holloway descended the stairs, Martinez close behind him, both men moving with the cautious gait of people who knew something was profoundly wrong, but couldn't yet articulate what. Davidson stepped forward, extending his hand. Captain Holloway, I'm Colonel Michael Davidson, United States Air Force. Welcome to Offutt Air Force Base. Holloway shook the offered hand, his grip firm. Colonel, I'm going to need some answers. Why were we escorted here by fighter jets? What's going on? All in good time, Captain. First, I need to ask you some questions. You transmitted that you departed Chicago on June 15, 1961. Can you confirm that? Of course I can confirm it. We took off just after 7 this morning. Holloway checked his watch. It's now... He stopped, frowning at the timepiece. Like Thomas Chen's watch in the cabin, it had frozen at 9:47. Captain Holloway, Davidson said carefully, choosing his words with precision, what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to accept, but I need you to stay calm, for your own sake and for your passengers. Something in Davidson's tone made Holloway's stomach clench. What are you saying? According to our instruments, sensors, and calendars, today's date is June 15, 2001. You and your aircraft have been missing for exactly 40 years. The words seemed to hang in the air, too absurd to be processed. Martinez let out a sound that was half laugh, half gasp. That's impossible, that's completely... I know how it sounds, Davidson interrupted. But look around you, gentlemen. Look at the vehicles, the aircraft, the uniforms, the technology. Does any of this look like 1961 to you? Holloway turned slowly, taking in his surroundings with new eyes. The military vehicles were indeed unfamiliar in design, all smooth lines and digital displays. The soldiers carried weapons he didn't recognize. In the distance, he could see aircraft hangars housing jets of types he'd never seen, alongside what appeared to be helicopters of radically advanced design. And on Davidson's belt, he noticed a small rectangular device with a glowing screen, some kind of communications equipment, perhaps, but nothing like any radio he'd ever encountered. The light, Holloway said quietly. That wall of light we flew through. What was it? We don't know, Dr. Chen interjected, stepping forward. I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, a physicist. What you experienced appears to have been a naturally occurring temporal displacement phenomenon. In layman's terms, you flew through a crack in time itself. Martinez leaned against the stair railing, his face gray. This can't be happening. This can't be real. I need you both to focus, Davidson said firmly. Right now, 73 passengers and 3 crew members are sitting in that aircraft, and they're going to have questions. We need to debrief you, examine the aircraft, and prepare a strategy for breaking this news to them. Can you do that? Holloway straightened, his military training reasserting itself. What do you need from us? First, tell me exactly what happened during your flight. Every detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem. For the next 20 minutes, Holloway and Martinez recounted their experience, with Dr. Chen recording everything and occasionally asking clarifying questions. When they finished, she was nodding to herself, as if the account confirmed something she had suspected. The temporal barrier you described matches theoretical models of a Schwarzschild de Sitter bridge, she explained. Essentially, space-time folded in on itself, creating a shortcut between 2 points in time. You entered in 1961 and exited in 2001. Can it happen again? Martinez asked. Can we go back? Dr. Chen hesitated. We'd need to study the phenomenon extensively. Even if we could locate another occurrence, attempting to use it would be extraordinarily dangerous. You were fortunate, if we can call it that, to survive the first transit. Inside the aircraft, tension was building. The passengers had watched through the windows as their pilots descended and spoke with military personnel. The armed soldiers surrounding the plane had not gone unnoticed. Margaret Sullivan moved through the cabin trying to maintain order, but questions were being hurled at her from every direction. Why are we at a military base? Demanded Harold Whitmore. We're supposed to be going to San Francisco. What's with all the soldiers? Another passenger asked. Are we under arrest? Eleanor Hayes sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, but her mind was working rapidly. She had noticed the same things Holloway had. The unfamiliar vehicle designs, the strange aircraft, the modern appearance of everything around them. And she had noticed something else. Through the window she could see a soldier holding what appeared to be a telephone, but it had no visible cord and was small enough to fit in his hand. She was a well-read woman, someone who enjoyed science fiction novels, and a terrible thought was beginning to form in her mind. Thomas Chen had his briefcase open and was methodically checking his possessions. His wallet was there with his $127 in cash, his identification papers, his letters of recommendation. Everything was as it had been when he boarded, but his watch remained frozen, and outside the window, the world looked subtly but undeniably wrong. Little Susan Whitmore pressed her face against the window. Mommy, why do all the cars look so weird? Patricia Whitmore pulled her daughter away from the window. Don't stare, dear. It's not polite. But Susan's observation had caught the attention of other passengers. More people crowded to the windows, pointing at the vehicles on the tarmac. A bus had pulled up nearby to transport them to a debriefing facility, and its design was unlike anything they had seen. Sleek, modern, with large tinted windows and a shape that suggested decades of aerodynamic refinement. The aircraft door opened again, and Captain Holloway re-entered, followed by Colonel Davidson, Dr. Chen, and several other officials. Holloway made his way to the front of the cabin, his face grave. Margaret Sullivan positioned herself beside him, sensing that something momentous was about to be announced. Ladies and gentlemen, Holloway began, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt inside. I need your complete attention. What I'm about to tell you will be difficult to believe, but I assure you it is the truth as it has been explained to me. The cabin fell silent. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. During our flight, we passed through an unusual atmospheric phenomenon, a wall of light unlike anything in normal weather patterns. According to the scientists here, that phenomenon was not a weather event. It was something else entirely, something that affected not just our position in space, but our position in time. Murmurs began rippling through the passengers, but Holloway pressed on. The date we departed Chicago was June 15, 1961. The date we landed here, according to every calendar and every official record, is June 15, 2001. For us, the flight has lasted only a few hours. For the rest of the world, 40 years have passed. For a moment, no one reacted. The statement was too large, too impossible to process. Then Harold Whitmore stood up, his face flushed. This is absurd. This is some kind of joke. I wish it were, Davidson said, stepping forward. Mr. Whitmore, isn't it? I understand your skepticism, but I'm going to show you something that I hope will convince you. Davidson held up his tablet computer, its screen glowing with a digital display that would have seemed like something from a science fiction film to the passengers. He touched the screen, itself a technology that wouldn't exist in 1961, and pulled up a news website. "This is called a tablet computer," Davidson explained. "It's connected wirelessly to a global communications network called the Internet. I'm showing you today's newspaper from the Chicago Tribune." He held up the device so passengers could see. The masthead clearly read, Friday, June 15th, 2001. The headline spoke of a world utterly foreign to them. Dow Jones closes at record high. Microsoft appeals antitrust ruling. Scientists map human genome. "Those papers could be faked," someone called out. "They could," Davidson agreed. "So let me show you something more personal." He touched the screen again, pulling up a series of photographs. "This is Chicago today, your city, 40 years later." He held up images of a transformed skyline. The Sears Tower still dominated the view, but it was surrounded by dozens of new skyscrapers, their designs distinctly modern. The streets below showed cars of unfamiliar makes and models. The fashion on pedestrians walking the sidewalks was completely different from 1961 styles. Eleanor Hayes stood up, her voice shaking. "Show us the newspaper archives. Show us the reports of our disappearance." Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. "That's an excellent idea." She took the tablet and quickly navigated to a different website. Within moments, she had pulled up digitized newspaper articles from June 1961. "Pan-Continental Flight 914 missing over Nebraska," she read aloud. 78 feared dead after aircraft vanishes. These articles are from June 18, 1961, 3 days after you disappeared. There are dozens more documenting the search efforts, the memorial services, the investigation into what happened. She scrolled through more articles from later years, showing how the unsolved disappearance had become one of aviation's enduring mysteries. Patricia Whitmore gasped when Dr. Chen showed an article that included a photograph of the Whitmore family, taken from their boarding passes, with the caption, "Among the Missing." Thomas Chen sat down heavily, his briefcase falling from his numb fingers. "My interview," he said to no one in particular. "I was going to interview at Fairchild Electronics. I was going to start a new life." The reality was beginning to sink in, wave after terrible wave. These people had left behind lives, families, futures, parents, children, spouses, friends. Everyone they knew had lived 40 years without them, had mourned them, had moved on or passed away themselves. The jobs they'd held no longer existed. The homes they'd lived in had been sold or demolished. The world itself had transformed beyond recognition. Young David Whitmore began to cry, not fully understanding but sensing the distress in his parents. His mother pulled both children close, tears streaming down her own face. Around the cabin, the emotional dam was breaking. Some passengers sat in stunned silence, others wept, a few became angry, demanding this be some elaborate hoax. Captain Holloway moved through the cabin, placing a steady hand on shoulders, speaking quietly to individuals, using every ounce of his command presence to keep the situation from deteriorating into complete chaos. Margaret Sullivan and the other attendants did the same, falling back on their training even in circumstances no training could have prepared them for. "Ladies and gentlemen," Davidson called out, raising his voice to be heard over the tumult. "I know this is overwhelming. I know you're frightened and confused, but I promise you, we're going to help you through this. We have counselors standing by, medical personnel, support staff. We're going to take you to a secure facility where you can rest, where we can answer your questions, and where we can begin the process of helping you adjust to your situation." "Adjust?" Harold Whitmore said bitterly. "How do you adjust to losing 40 years of your life? How do you adjust to everyone you've ever known being 40 years older or dead? One day at a time," Davidson said quietly. "With support, with patience, and with hope. You're all alive. You're all healthy. That's more than anyone expected. And it's something to build on." Over the next hour, the passengers were carefully escorted from the aircraft to the waiting bus. Medical teams checked each person, noting that they showed no signs of physical harm from their temporal transit. No radiation burns, no cellular damage, nothing beyond the psychological trauma of their situation. They were transported to a specially prepared facility on the base, a dormitory that had been hastily converted into a temporary home for the displaced travelers. As the sun set on June 15, 2001, 78 people from 1961 sat in a conference room, listening to a team of experts explain the basics of how the world had changed. They learned about the Cold War that had ended, about the fall of the Berlin Wall, about computers and the internet and cell phones and 1,000 other innovations that had reshaped human civilization. They learned about the space shuttle program, about the International Space Station, about rovers on Mars and probes at the edge of the solar system. But more personally devastating were the individual searches. Thomas Chen learned that his parents had passed away in the 1980s. Eleanor Hayes discovered that her sister had died in a car accident in 1975. Harold Whitmore found that his elderly mother had lived until 1998, spending the last 37 years of her life believing her son and grandchildren were dead. Captain Holloway sat alone in a small office late that night, a computer terminal in front of him. He'd been given a quick tutorial in using the device, staring at a photograph on the screen. It showed an elderly woman standing outside a modest house, smiling at the camera. The caption identified her as Janet Holloway, age 79, his wife, the woman he had kissed goodbye just that morning, who had been 39 years old when he left, was now in her 8th decade. Her dark hair turned white, her smooth face lined with age and worry, and decades of living without him. According to the records, Janet had never remarried. She had waited, hoped, mourned, and finally accepted. She had lived a full life, taught school, traveled, made friends, stayed close to family, but she had never stopped wondering what happened to the man she loved. "We can arrange a meeting," Dr. Chen said softly from the doorway. "If you'd like." "She lives in Phoenix now with her daughter." "Her daughter," Holloway repeated. "She remarried then?" "No, she adopted, in 1965, a little girl named Emily. She's 36 now, a lawyer in Phoenix." Dr. Chen paused. "Captain, Janet Holloway never gave up believing you were alive somewhere. When we contacted her earlier today to tell her you'd been found, she collapsed from shock. She's at the hospital now under observation, but she's asking to see you." Holloway stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the elderly woman with the vibrant young wife he'd left behind that morning. He was still 42. She was 79. The mathematics of it made no sense. The emotional reality of it, even less. "What do I say to her?" he asked. "How do I explain that I'm not the man she waited for? I haven't lived those 40 years. I haven't earned the right to that reunion." "You're exactly the man she waited for," Dr. Chen countered. "You're the man who left her in 1961. The fact that you took a shortcut to 2001 doesn't change who you are." But Holloway wasn't so sure. He'd cheated time, skipped over 40 years of history, of change, of growing and living and experiencing. What right did he have to walk back into anyone's life? Similar conversations were happening throughout the facility. Families were being contacted, arrangements made, reunions planned. But each reunion came with its own impossible complexity. How did a 34-year-old woman meet a 74-year-old sister? How did a 10-year-old boy process having 50-year-old contemporaries? Dr. Chen had assembled a team of psychologists, sociologists, and counselors to help the displaced passengers navigate these challenges. But even the experts admitted they were in uncharted territory. There were no textbooks for this, no established protocols for helping people who had literally lost decades of their lives. In the women's dormitory, Eleanor Hayes sat with several other female passengers, trying to process the day's revelations. The provided television, a flat screen of remarkable clarity mounted on the wall, played news coverage of their arrival. They watched themselves become a global sensation, the time flight, as the media had already dubbed it. "They want to study us," Carol Jennings said bitterly. "We're lab rats now. They want to understand what happened," Eleanor corrected. "So do I. Don't you want to know how this is possible?" "I want to know how to undo it," Patricia Whitmore said, sitting on her bed with her children sleeping fitfully beside her. "I want to wake up and have this be a nightmare." But it wasn't a nightmare. It was a new reality, one they would have to learn to navigate. And as the night deepened and the facility grew quiet, 78 displaced souls lay awake, staring at ceilings, wrestling with questions no one should have to answer. In his office, Colonel Davidson compiled his report for Washington, knowing that by morning, this facility would be inundated with every intelligence agency, military branch, and scientific organization in the country. The aircraft itself was being dismantled, every rivet and wire examined for clues to its temporal transit. The passengers would face endless interviews, medical tests, psychological evaluations. But beneath all the military and scientific concerns lay a simpler human truth. 78 people's lives had been irrevocably changed, torn from one era and thrust into another. and no amount of study or analysis would give them back what they'd lost. 3 months had passed since Pan-Continental Flight 914 landed in a world 40 years removed from the one it had departed. The initial media frenzy had subsided into a steady simmer of ongoing coverage, documentary crews, book deals, and endless speculation. The aircraft itself had been meticulously studied, and now rested in a climate-controlled hangar at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, a museum piece that had become the most scrutinized object in the history of aviation. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in that hangar on a cool September morning, reviewing the latest data on her tablet. After 3 months of exhaustive analysis, they were no closer to understanding how the temporal displacement had occurred. The aircraft showed elevated levels of chronometric particles, yes, but replicating the conditions that had caused the displacement remained impossible. They had launched weather balloons, sent aircraft through the same airspace, and monitored the region with every sensor technology available. Nothing. The phenomenon, whatever it had been, had not recurred. Dead end? Colonel Davidson asked, approaching from behind her. More like infinite end, Chen replied. Every avenue of investigation opens up 10 more questions. The physics of what happened shouldn't be possible according to our current understanding, yet it clearly happened. We have 78 people as proof. How are they doing? Davidson asked. The passengers? Chen's expression grew somber. Mixed results. Some are adapting better than expected. Others, she trailed off, not needing to finish the sentence. The integration of the Flight 914 passengers into 2001 had proven as complex as feared. The government had provided financial support, education programs, psychological counseling, and housing assistance. Each passenger had been granted legal status as a unique category of temporally displaced person, with documentation that acknowledged their unusual circumstances while providing them with social security numbers, birth certificates amended to reflect their situation, and other necessary paperwork. Captain Richard Holloway sat in a small apartment in Omaha, staring out the window at a city that was familiar, yet foreign. He had met with Janet, his wife, exactly once. The reunion had been held at a neutral location, a private room at the hospital where she'd been taken after receiving the news of his return. He'd walked into that room and seen an old woman sitting in a wheelchair, her face lined and aged, but her eyes were still the same. She'd looked at him with an expression that combined joy, grief, disbelief, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Perhaps resentment, perhaps relief. "Hello, Janet," he'd said, his voice cracking. She'd wept. He'd wept. They'd held hands, his smooth and young, hers veined and spotted with age. They'd talked for an hour, speaking of the life she'd lived, the daughter she'd raised, the decades she'd endured without him. And then, by unspoken agreement, they'd parted. "I can't do this to you," she'd said. "You're still young. You deserve a life, not an obligation to an old woman who happens to carry your name. You're my wife," he'd protested. "I was your wife," she'd corrected gently. 40 years ago. We're different people now, Richard. The kindest thing we can do for each other is acknowledge that." They'd stayed in touch via email, a technology he'd had to learn to use. She sent him photographs of their daughter Emily, who had her own complicated feelings about meeting a father who was younger than she was. But Holloway hadn't worked up the courage for that meeting yet. What could he possibly say to a woman who thought of him as a father when he was 42 and she was 36? Instead, he'd taken a job with a small regional airline, retraining on modern aircraft. The technology was staggering. Glass cockpits, GPS navigation, computerized flight management systems. It was like learning to fly all over again. But he was grateful for the challenge, for something to occupy his mind beyond the endless loop of regret and displacement. James Martinez had made a different choice. He'd returned to California and, after much hesitation, had reached out to his family. His parents were deceased, but he had 3 siblings, all now in their 60s. The reunion had been surreal. His younger brother was now 27 years his senior. His sisters were grandmothers. They'd welcomed him with a mixture of joy and bewilderment, and Martinez had thrown himself into rebuilding those relationships, accepting his role as the perpetually young uncle to a vast extended family he was only beginning to know. Eleanor Hayes had perhaps the most bittersweet story. She'd learned that her sister Margaret had indeed died in 1975, but Margaret had left behind 3 children. Eleanor's nieces and nephews, now in their 40s and 50s, had reached out cautiously. They'd heard stories about Aunt Eleanor all their lives, seen photographs, but had naturally assumed She was lost in some tragedy decades before they were born. Eleanor now lived with her niece in Oakland, the same city her sister had lived in, and had found purpose in teaching again. The education system had changed dramatically, but her skills as an educator translated across the decades. She worked with immigrant children, helping them adapt to a new culture, and found in their struggles a mirror of her own displacement. The Whitmore family faced perhaps the most complex situation. Harold and Patricia had to raise their children in a world neither they nor their offspring understood. David, now technically 50 years old but biologically still 10, enrolled in elementary school where he was surrounded by children born in the 1990s. His classmates carried cell phones, played video games, and referenced movies and TV shows he'd never heard of. Susan, at 8, adapted somewhat more easily, her younger age making the transition less jarring. But Harold and Patricia struggled profoundly. Harold's job skills, management techniques from 1961 were hopelessly outdated. Patricia's experience as a housewife translated poorly into an era when women's roles had dramatically evolved. They attended classes on modern technology, took courses to update their knowledge but felt perpetually behind, as if running a race that had started 40 years before they'd arrived at the starting line. Thomas Chen had initially despaired when he learned of his parents' deaths, but he'd discovered something unexpected. The electronics firm he'd been traveling to interview with in 1961 had grown into a major Silicon Valley company. When he'd contacted them, explaining his unique situation, they'd been intrigued enough to offer him a position in their historical archives department. He was, after all, someone who had actually lived through the era their earliest products came from. He could provide first-hand accounts of the technological landscape of 1961, helping the company understand its own roots. More than that, Chen had returned to school, studying modern computer science with the intensity of someone who'd glimpsed the future and wanted to understand how humanity had arrived there. His engineering background from 1961 gave him a unique perspective, and he found himself fascinated by the evolution of technology he'd missed. But not all the passengers adapted so well. 3 had attempted suicide in the first month, overwhelmed by the magnitude of their loss. 2 succeeded. The survivors among the 78 carried that grief with them, knowing that for some the displacement had been too much to bear. Margaret Sullivan, the lead flight attendant, had become something of a spokesperson for the group. She'd appeared on talk shows, given interviews, and written a memoir titled Yesterday's Tomorrow that had become a bestseller. Some of the other passengers resented her for profiting from their shared trauma, but others appreciated that she was telling their story, helping the world understand what they'd experienced. "We didn't choose this," she'd said in one televised interview. "We were just people going about our lives, taking a routine flight, and then, in an instant, everything we knew was gone." Imagine boarding a plane and landing to discover everyone you love is either old or dead, that your entire context for understanding the world is obsolete, that you're functionally an immigrant in time itself. That's what we live with every day. The scientific community remained obsessed with Flight 914. Dr. Chen had published several papers on the chronometric anomaly, though her conclusions were necessarily speculative. The military had established a monitoring network across the Midwest, hoping to detect if the phenomenon recurred. But as months passed without a repeat occurrence, funding and interest began to wane. Maybe it was a one-time event, Davidson suggested as he and Chen walked through the hangar, past the silent DC-6. A cosmic accident that will never happen again. Or maybe it happens all the time and we've just never caught one before? Chen countered. How many missing aircraft over the years might have experienced similar displacements? How many crews and passengers might be out there, scattered across time, with no one believing their story? It was a haunting thought. The DC-6 stood as mute testimony to the universe's capacity for impossibility. Every rivet, every gauge, every seat cushion had been analyzed. They'd found nothing that explained the displacement, no exotic radiation or structural anomaly that might have caused or survived the transit. The plane was, in every measurable way, simply a normal DC-6, except for its impossible journey. In early October, a reunion was held at a hotel in Chicago. All surviving passengers of Flight 914 were invited, along with the crew. 63 people attended. Some had declined, finding the reminder too painful, and 2 were deceased from the suicides that still haunted the group. Captain Holloway stood at a podium, looking out at the assembled faces. They ranged in age from the 8-year-old Susan Whitmore to 75-year-old Herbert Granger. a retired businessman who'd been traveling to a conference in 1961, but their biological ages told a different story. They were all still the ages they'd been in June. 3 months ago, Holloway began, we were strangers thrown together by chance on an ordinary flight. Then the extraordinary happened, and we became something else. Not a family exactly, but something similar. We're the only people on Earth who truly understand what each other has experienced. He paused, collecting his thoughts. I've struggled these past months with anger, with grief, with a sense of profound loss. We all have, and I don't have answers for why this happened to us. I don't know if we'll ever understand the mechanism that brought us here, but I do know this. We have a choice in how we respond. We can let this define us as victims, as people to be pitied or studied or viewed as curiosities, or we can choose to see ourselves as something else, as pioneers of a sort. We're living proof that time isn't as fixed as we thought, that the universe is stranger and more wonderful than we imagined, and we have knowledge that no one else possesses. We remember 1961 not as history, but as lived experience. We can offer something unique to the world. Eleanor Hayes stood up from her seat. Richard's right. I teach children who've been displaced from their homes by war or poverty or circumstance. I tell them that displacement doesn't have to mean defeat. It can mean opportunity. We didn't choose to come here, but we're here now. We can honor what we've lost while still building something meaningful with what we have. Around the room, other passengers nodded. Some wept, but there was also, tentatively, hope. They were survivors after all. They'd endured something impossible and emerged intact, if changed. James Martinez raised a glass. To Flight 912, he said. May we prove that the human spirit can adapt to anything, even the impossible. To Flight 914, the room echoed. As the evening progressed, stories were shared. Thomas Chen talked about his work in Silicon Valley, how surreal it was to use technologies he'd only dreamed of. Carol Jennings, one of the flight attendants, spoke about returning to nursing school and being amazed by medical advances she'd missed. Herbert Granger, despite his advanced age, had embraced modern technology with gusto and started a blog about experiencing the future firsthand. But there were also acknowledgments of the pain. Patricia Whitmore spoke tearfully about explaining to her children why they couldn't see their grandmother, why the house they'd been moving to no longer existed, why everything they'd known was gone. Others shared similar stories of grief, of struggling to adapt, of feeling perpetually out of step with the world around them. We're time's refugees, someone said, displaced persons from a dead decade. Yet there was also resilience. Human beings, it seemed, could adapt to even the most bizarre circumstances. Given time, support, and purpose, they could learn to navigate a world transformed. It wouldn't be easy. For many, it would be a lifelong struggle, but it was possible. 6 months after their arrival, Dr. Chen published her final report on Flight 912. Her conclusion was simultaneously frustrating and fascinating. The temporal displacement appeared to have been caused by a naturally occurring wormhole, a bridge through space-time that existed for mere seconds before collapsing. The chances of another aircraft encountering such a phenomenon were astronomical, perhaps not impossible, but close to it. In effect, she wrote, the passengers and crew of Pan-Continental Flight 912 experienced the rarest event in recorded history. They passed through a door in time that may never open again. From a scientific standpoint, we may never fully understand the mechanism, but from a human standpoint, we can marvel at their resilience and learn from their experience about adaptation, grief, and hope. The DC-6 was eventually moved to the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, where it became one of the most visited exhibits in the museum's history. A plaque beside it read, Pan-Continental Flight 914, departed Chicago June 15, 1961, arrived Omaha June 15, 2001, a testament to the mysteries of the universe and the resilience of the human spirit. Captain Richard Holloway attended the dedication ceremony. He stood before the aircraft he'd flown through time, its aluminum skin gleaming under museum lights, and felt a complex mixture of emotions. This machine had carried him and his passengers across 4 decades in a handful of hours. It had stolen 40 years from them, or given them a future they would never have otherwise seen, depending on how one chose to look at it. Beside him stood Janet, his wife who was no longer his wife, yet who remained his closest connection to the life he'd left behind. She'd insisted on attending despite her frail health. Emily, their adopted daughter, stood on Janet's other side, providing support. Do you regret it? Janet asked him quietly as they gazed at the aircraft. If you could go back, would you choose a different flight? Holloway considered the question. If he'd taken a different flight, he would have lived those 40 years normally. He would have aged alongside Janet, raised Emily, experienced the transformation of the world gradually, rather than in a single jarring jump. But he also would have lost something ineffable, the knowledge that time itself could be transcended, that the universe held wonders beyond human comprehension. I don't know, he admitted. I've lost so much. We all have. But I've also gained a perspective that no one else possesses. I've seen firsthand that the impossible is possible. That has to count for something. Janet squeezed his hand. You were always a philosopher, Richard. That hasn't changed. They stood together in silence, three people connected by an impossible event, finding what meaning they could in circumstances beyond their control. Over the following years, the passengers of Flight 914 would continue to adapt, to struggle, to grow. Some would thrive in their new temporal home, building careers and families and finding purpose. Others would never fully adjust, would always feel like visitors in a foreign land. But all of them would carry with them the knowledge that they had experienced something unique in human history. Thomas Chen would eventually become a professor of computer science, teaching students about the evolution of technology from the unique perspective of someone who'd lived in 1961 and adapted to 2001. His textbooks would become standard references, not just for their technical content but for their philosophical insights about technological change and human adaptation. Eleanor Hayes would write a book about her experiences titled Teaching Across Time that would become required reading in education programs across the country. Her insights into cultural displacement and adaptation would prove valuable beyond the unique circumstances that inspired them. The Whitmore children would grow up with therapists and support systems, learning to navigate a world their parents barely understood. They would become, in a sense, the first generation of children raised across temporal boundaries, their experiences studied by psychologists and sociologists for decades to come. Captain Holloway would eventually meet Emily properly, his daughter who was older than him. The relationship would be awkward at first, neither quite knowing how to relate to the other, but over time, they would find common ground, building something new rather than trying to recreate what might have been. And James Martinez would reconnect with his elderly siblings, becoming the family historian, the keeper of memories from a shared past, only he still experienced as recent. He would spend countless hours recording oral histories, preserving stories of the family's earlier days that would otherwise have been lost to time. 10 years after the displacement, a documentary crew would return to interview the survivors of Flight 914. They found people who had, against all odds, built lives in a time not their own. Some marriages had formed between passengers, bonds forged in shared experience. Children had been born, temporal natives with parents from the past. Careers had been built, homes established, roots put down in foreign soil. Do you still think of 1961 as home? The interviewer asked Eleanor Hayes. She'd paused, considering the question carefully. I think of it as where I'm from, she'd finally answered. But home is where you make it, and after 10 years I've made a home here. It's not the home I expected, not the life I planned, but it's mine. We all own our stories, even when those stories include the impossible. The interviewer had turned to Captain Holloway next. If the phenomenon recurred, if you could fly back to 1961, would you? Holloway, now in his 50s but biologically still in his early 40s, had smiled. You know, everyone asks that question, and the answer is no. Not because I don't miss that world. I do desperately sometimes. But because going back would mean undoing everything I've built here. It would mean erasing the relationships I've formed, the person I've become. The past is behind us, even when we've arrived at the present through unusual means. You can only move forward. As the years passed, the story of Pan-Continental Flight 914 would be told and retold, analyzed and theorized, used as metaphor and inspiration. It would spawn countless theories, some scientific, some philosophical, some purely imaginative. But at its core, it remained a profoundly human story about loss, adaptation, and resilience. Dr. Sarah Chen would continue monitoring for chronometric anomalies, her life's work shaped by those few hours she'd spent examining an impossible aircraft. She never detected another temporal displacement event, but she never stopped looking. Somewhere in the universe, she believed, the doors in time opened and closed, connecting moments and eras in ways humanity was only beginning to imagine. The DC-6 remained in the Smithsonian, a silent witness to its own impossible journey. Millions would visit it over the decades, pressing close to the velvet ropes, photographing its vintage interior, marveling at the mundane seats and controls that had carried people across 4 decades. For many visitors, it would be a curiosity, a strange footnote in history, but for others, it would serve as a reminder that the universe was far stranger and more wonderful than they'd imagined, that time itself might not be the fixed river they'd assumed, and that human beings possessed a remarkable capacity to adapt to even the most impossible circumstances. And on quiet nights, when the museum was closed and the aircraft sat in darkness, if one listened very carefully, one might almost hear the echo of engines that had carried 78 souls through a door that shouldn't have existed, delivering them to a future they could never have anticipated but were learning day by day to call home. The story of Flight 914 had no neat resolution, because life itself offers no neat resolutions. The passengers would carry their displacement with them always, a fundamental part of their identity. They were people out of time, anachronisms in flesh and blood, proof that the universe held deeper mysteries than humanity had yet solved. But they were also proof of something else, that people could endure the unendurable, adapt to the impossible, and find meaning even in the most disorienting circumstances. They had lost 40 years, yes, but they had gained something too, a perspective on human resilience, on the nature of time and change, on what it meant to be fundamentally displaced and yet still choose to move forward. As Captain Richard Holloway would later write in his own memoir, published 15 years after the displacement, "We didn't choose to be time travelers. We were just ordinary people who boarded an ordinary flight, but the universe had other plans. And in the end, we learned that being ordinary in extraordinary circumstances requires its own kind of courage. We learned that home isn't a place or a time, but a state of being you create through choice and commitment. We learned that the past doesn't have to define you, even when the past is the only thing you can truly call your own. And perhaps most importantly, we learned that the future, no matter how strange or unexpected, is still a future worth living." In the end, the flight that took off in 1961 and landed in 2001 became more than an inexplicable phenomenon. It became a story about human adaptation, about loss and acceptance, about finding hope in impossible circumstances. And in that sense, it became timeless, a story that would resonate across generations, reminding people that no matter how disorienting life's changes might be, the human spirit possessed an extraordinary capacity to adapt, to endure, and ultimately, to thrive. The 78 passengers and crew of Pan-Continental Flight 914 would forever be remembered as the people who crossed time itself. But their true legacy wasn't the journey they made. It was the lives they built after arriving, the courage they showed in facing each day in a world they'd never expected to see, and the hope they maintained even when everything they'd known was lost to the past.